All right, we've got a couple guests with us in our Abuja studios to discuss this. Professor Uche Uwaleke, who is a capital markets professor at the Nasarawa State University, KEFI, and also the president of the Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria. And our second guest, we also have joining us is Basil Abia, who is a co-founder policy analyst at Veriv Africa. Good morning to you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. Professor, let me start with you. GDP rebasing, of course, supposed to take place every 5 years. Haven't had that since, 2014 or so. Professor Uwaleke, you've, of course, been participating in the rebasing workshops with the MBS. What do you think the challenge has been?
Yeah, thanks so much, Rotus. As you rightly observed, yes, I've been participating in some of the engagements, stakeholder engagements organized by the MBS. And I want to say it's a good thing that they are doing this, continuing with the engagement, because it's very important for the public to be aware of what they're doing. And it's also important that at the end of the day, whatever comes out to be, if you like, generally, accepted and then welcomed, by the public. Let me say better late than never. Yes, it's meant to be every 5 years, but better late, than never. The importance of the rebasing cannot be overemphasized. We know that the inflation and GDP data are very, very important in economic planning. Every year, you find the government including those targets, in annual budgets. For this year, for example, we are targeting 15% inflation rate and GDP growth rate of over 4%. And of course, this is also something that the investors are all watching out for. Investors are conscious about, what inflation rate figure is. And of course, it's a very important input in monetary policy decisions of the central bank. So why have we not done that, for a long time now? Well, let me also use the reason the MBS has given. It's largely because of funding. It's a very huge exercise. Take, for example, the last one the National Bureau of Statistics conducted, talking about the input that goes into the rebasing, the National Living Standard Survey. The National Living Standard Survey of 2023 involved 60 enumeration areas, 10 households in each of those enumeration areas. So that gives you 600 households. Now, if you look at per state, then if you look at that, across all the 36 states, you're having over 22,000 households. So it's really huge, and that is something that requires a lot of funding. And, some will even argue that it is also because of funding that you don't have the sample size, sometimes, appear to be small, relative to the size of the, of the population and the size of Nigeria. So essentially, it's funding that has been the major challenge.
Thank you so much. Basil Abia, policy analyst over at Veriv Africa, also co-founder. Last time we had you on the show, we were discussing the third quarter GDP figures, which you said weren't enough to keep up with population growth. Why is this rebasing important, Basil? All right, we're speaking, of course, Professor Uwaleke and Basil Abia. They're both our guests in our Abuja studios. We're talking about the rebasing of GDP. Let's get back to Professor Uwaleke. Professor, while we're sorting Basil's audio out, Professor Uwaleke, why should the average Nigerian on the street care about rebasing the country's GDP? What does it do for them? If you're a professor, your student comes up to you and said, Professor, why should we care? What's your answer?
Okay, well, of course, the average Nigerian is concerned about the state of the economy. We can also look at it from the state of the economy. Well, let me even put it this way. 2 months ago, I was in, Conakry, addressing some finance experts from, ECOWAS member countries, and one of the things I told them is that, of course, this is something that they already know. I said Nigeria is the biggest economy in West Africa, and also the biggest. We have the biggest, stock market, in West Africa. So you see, that tells you that size because I made an impression when I said that. So size matters, if you like, because what it gives the person listening to me, you can get the impression that yes, this can represent a lot of business opportunities in Nigeria. If you say you're the biggest economy, we used to be the biggest economy in Africa, and that represents a lot of business potentials, particularly from somebody who is thinking of coming to invest in Nigeria. He sees that potential. Remember, GDP too, you can also look at GDP from the income angle. You have the expenditure angle, you have the income approach, and you also have the output approach. So if you look at it from the income angle and you say you are the biggest economy, of course, that tells a prospective investor that there is business in that kind of country, and that can motivate the person to come and do business in Nigeria. So it's, it matters to the ordinary Nigerian. And I also told you about the issue of even being an input into monetary policy. Okay, the central bank relies on inflation data in some of the policies that they make, and of course we know how interest rates impact the economy. You can also talk about what happens even in the capital market. Investors are also looking at the inflation rate. The other Nigerian that wants to invest in the capital market is also looking at the inflation rate. The good thing we have in Nigeria is that the capital market, has been resilient and most of the time outperforming the inflation rate. Inflation, for example, inflation rate in Nigeria today, the latest is 34.6%. But the capital market, the stock market last year, year-to-date return was as high as 34.6%. Sorry, that is over 37%. So year-to-date return has been, if you like, in terms of real return on investments on the capital market, positive, as opposed to what you have in other markets. So these numbers are very important to the ordinary Nigerian. And of course, with the rebasing, we expect that the numbers will be larger this time. And if the GDP eventually turns out to be larger, as we are expecting, of course, that will also mean that some of the metrics that are ratios that are benchmarked to GDP, will improve. Something like debt to GDP ratio, you expect that to improve. So any metric that has GDP as its denominator will improve. And as I said, there are also people that look at that from a favorable point of view. Okay. Investors, even those, even creditors. Somebody who wants to give you credit will be interested in also looking at the size of your GDP.
Thank you, Professor Uwaleke.
Overall, I think the rebasing will be in the interest of
all
the economy,
Nigerians.
and of course, the ordinary Nigerian will find it beneficial.
Duly noted. We're going to take a quick break. I want to talk about inflation after the break, so do stay with us. Still talking about rebasing GDP and consumer price index after the break. Global Business Report, Rise News. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. We still have our guests in Abuja, and we're talking about the rebasing of Nigeria's gross domestic product and consumer price index, GDP, the former to 2019, the latter CPI to 2024. We have Professor Uwaleke of the Nasarawa University and also Basil Abia, who is co-founder and policy analyst at Veriv Africa. So Basil, hopefully you can hear me now. I wanted to first ask you on the rebasement, why it is important, Basil, from your perspective, where you play in the market.
Yeah, rebasing is very important from an economic perspective, especially economic statistics. You want it to be as frequent as possible. Best practices, global best practices, asks for 5 years, especially with regards to GDP and CPI. But normally, most countries do 10 years afterwards. So for me, from my own perspective and from the private sector perspective, the methodology has to be updated every 5 years. I have concerns, of course, with the rate reference period and the price reference period, and I'm sure you would want to find out in your subsequent question. But it's very important, it's a nationally important endeavor.
All right, great. Let's get to that now. We're going to get to inflation. I want you both to listen to a conversation that we had here on the Global Business Report in July of 2022 with Mr. Bismarck Rewane, CEO MD of Financial Derivatives Company Limited, on this very topic. So let's take a listen to what he had to say back then.
Two things here. One, there's a question of data integrity, which Nigeria has not been known to be a unique example of integrity, not only in data, but in every other thing. So we have our reputation, which lives ahead of us in so many respects. So that's one. Two is the fact that the inflation basket is supposed to be reconstituted every 5 years. Naturally, your behavioral patterns, your demography, in fact, your life expectancy and all of that.
Yeah.
So the last time changes over time. Therefore, you need to reflect that in terms of changing your consumer basket.
Okay.
Even if it's just tweaking it a little bit. But the last time we did that was 2009. So quite frankly, going by the 5-year cycle, we are due for a third review, but we haven't done anything about it.
All right. So, look, we're in 2024 right now. Should have done one in 2019. No, actually, hold on. 2009. So, 2014, 2019, 2024. So, we should have had about 3 of these already. Now, the issue here, I think both of you differ on this, is that, we're talking about inflation now. The MBS has said they will rebase for CPI to 2024, while GDP is 2019. Basil, why do you have a problem with that? Let's start with you first.
Yeah, for me, it's the distortions that will arise. Let's not forget, when you put the ground zero, in this context, when you put the ground zero at 2024, that's the price reference period as your base year, you artificially generate an inflationary trend that is distorted. What do I mean by that? The ground zero for inflation calculation right after the usage of 2024 as your base year goes back to single digit. And when it goes back to single digit, because of the fact that 2024 was a specifically unique year from a price shock perspective, we had our record high headline inflation rate in 2024, don't forget. We had our record high in 28 years, record high food inflation rate as well. Food inflation rate at the highest by June 2024 was recorded at 40%. And, you know, we took up to 37% in headline inflation. Headline inflation now is currently at 34.60%. Food inflation is currently at 39%. So when your ground zero starts at that peak point, there is a tendency for the ground zero inflation calculation to go back to single digit, sometimes even lower than 5%. How does that reflect on the real story of price pressure? Now, let's not forget about the policy implications for this. From a monetary policy rate fixing perspective, the folks at the MPC, the CBN Monetary Policy Committee, are going to be a bit confused. I'm being serious. How are they going to know that they have to continue reining on inflation? How are they going to know that they have to maintain the hikes or keep the hikes at the level that it currently is? It's currently at 27.5%, if I'm not mistaken. So when you see that, and then investors start to look at the inflation rate at single digit, 4%, maybe at the ground zero level, there's that distortion that it causes. Now, there's a second perspective to this. The second perspective is, just like Bismarck Rwani said in that interview with you earlier last year, there is an issue with data integrity and public perception. Now, the public perception would be that if things are super high, our pockets are feeling the weight of the price shocks from the shock therapy that was performed by both the Central Bank of Nigeria and the Bola Ahmed Tinubu presidency. Why on earth are the folks at MBS reporting single-digit inflation rates and even lower than 5%? That causes a public perception problem. Now, we have already had that with the unemployment rate reportage. A lot of people from professional spaces to your everyday Nigerians to even government officials. I've had conversations with policymakers at the National Assembly who are just super confused as to what MBS are trying to do with the ILO methodology that they deployed. In fact, a particular House of Reps member told me that the ILO methodology, while it is a global practice standard, it doesn't reflect in all honesty, he says, it doesn't reflect the context, the actual local nuance of employment in Nigeria, because we're not a 24-hour economy. And the ILO methodology accounts for Western-centric employment trends. So these are the arguments you have to bring to the table. That public perception issue, but for me, I won't lie to you, is the public policy implications, especially from a monetary policy rate lens. Once you start ground zero at a price shock level, rather than from a stable year, base year, there is a problem. Now, let me also add the contradictions.
For the GDP rebasing, they put the base year at 2019. They cite that they cannot use 2020, that's the MBS. They cite that they cannot use 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, as well as 2024 for their GDP base year, because those years were economically unstable. Those were, of course, the price shock years of the last 30 years in Nigeria's economic history. And I agree with that point. 2019 was fairly stable compared to these years. Why aren't they using the same logic, especially since the bandwidth for weight reference and price reference can go as far as 5 years? Why can't you not pick 2019? You know, it presents a problem for even we researchers. If we're doing our time series analysis, for instance, we're not going to be able to capture the actual behavior of consumption patterns and price behavior, especially consumption patterns that comes with price shocks for 2021 to 2024, because we had the global inflation seep into our own macroeconomic environment by 2021. Of course, all of that, you know, was largely precipitated by the pandemic. And then you now had our own domestic shocks, starting in 2023, when Bola Ahmed Tinubu presidency took on the very primed neoliberal reforms in the economy, the devaluation of the naira, the unification of the exchange rate, market reflective tariff rates in our electricity tariff base, and then, of course, removal of fuel subsidies for the first time in 48 years. You know, these are things that generated legendary price shocks. We saw consumption patterns change drastically. We're seeing families spending close to 90% of their earnings on feeding every month. How are you able to record that when your ground zero starts at a price shock rather than a stable year period? So from a technical perspective, from a public policy perspective, and a public perception perspective, it is problematic to choose 2024 as your price reference period and 2023 as your weight reference period, especially, again, knowing that last year when I read the NBS slide during the workshops, they had put price reference period for 2022. Why the sudden change to 2024? That yields to the public perception issue. Is there a political hand somewhere trying to force for artificial inflation rates to feel good? That's my own concern.
All right. Very robust concerns from you there, Basil Abia. Professor Uwaleke, you've been working with the MBS, and we hope to have the MBS on so that they can, you know, discuss this at length. But okay, please, what's your response? That's all I have for you. What's your response to Basil?
Okay, well, before I even speak to the issue of weight and price reference periods, let me also talk about what Bismarck talked about, the data integrity. Now, data integrity with respect to the GDP rebasing. My major concern with that GDP rebasing, the way it's being proposed, is the inclusion of illegal activities. For the first time, there's an attempt to include illegal activities in the computation of GDP. By illegal activities, of course, one is talking about things like smuggling, activities of drug peddlers, prostitution, and so on, including human trafficking, kidnapping. So I don't think that would be a wise decision, for us to take, to include those activities in the computation of GDP. Again, the argument is in line with international standards. But if you put a query now on ChatGPT with respect to countries that include illegal activities in their GDP, you will only find perhaps the Euro area. It's only countries in the Euro area, 27 countries that make up the Euro area, that include that in their GDP because of the European system for national accounts, guidelines, issued by the Eurozone. So it is only these countries that are doing that. Canada, USA, for example, yes, include substantial part of the underground economy, but not informal economy, but not the illegal activities. And then it's also interesting to know that in Africa, there is no single country in Africa that is including illegal activities in the computation of GDP. So it's good to expand the number of products, number of sectors. For example, we hear
Professor, sorry, I'm so Professor,
the framework.
Professor, wait, just before you let go of that point, and since that was my next question. Is that a moral argument that you shouldn't include illegal activities? Are you arguing from a moral standpoint? Because it's still a transaction, is it not? Whether it's prostitution or drugs or whatever it is. Yes, but when you do that, you see, there are two issues with it. When you include legal activities in your GDP computation, number one, you tend to legitimize them. So you're making a moral argument.
And
so it's moral.
Two, there is also the.
So it's moral.
Yes, you legitimize them. Okay, why is the central bank not recognizing the black market rate? Why is it that today, when you talk about exchange rate, even for research purposes, if I'm doing a time series study on, say, the impact of exchange rate on inflation, okay, I would be, of course, collecting secondary data, from the central bank, and that data will be the official. No,
but Professor, we do use the black markets. But Professor Uwaleke, we do use the black markets. We use the black markets. You and I, Nigerians use the black market as a reference. We don't.
Yeah, it exists. I'm saying it exists, but it's not. You don't put an official stamp on it. That's the point I'm making. The illegal activities, yes, of course they exist. They are there, but let us not deliberately legitimize them. Okay, because tomorrow now you say the size of your economy is so has expanded because of illegal activities. It doesn't speak well, for us.
Okay, so it's a moral argument. So that it is moral. I just want to make
why you don't find any African.
Yeah, so it's moral.
No, but there's
it's
also
not a technical argument. It's moral.
Bismarck talked about data.
Yeah.
No, data integrity as well. Okay, how do you even establish the values or the values of those illegal activities? So for me, that's just the major concern I have, with the GDP rebasing. The issue of course, including the digital economy, including modular refineries, including pension funds activities, national social insurance, they are very, very good. But for illegal activities, I think we should exclude them. Okay, on the issue of the reference price, yes, for GDP 2019 makes a lot of sense. We had issues with 2020, and onwards. Very uncertainties, of course, came in. For the CPI, again, during the last stakeholder workshop that I attended, what was said at the time, that was in Abuja, was that the weight reference price was going to be 2023. The price reference price was going to be 2022, just as has been. Okay, it was only yesterday that I heard, that they are now moving into 2024. It's important again. Remember when I started, I said, whatever comes out should be, I used the word, generally, accepted. When I say generally, I mean by, the public, people should be able to welcome it and use it. Okay, in 2020, quarter 4, you remember, unemployment rate was at 3.3%. Then in 2023, suddenly in August, we dropped unemployment rate to said 4.1%. Okay, so you can see that's structural, distortion. So that is what we don't want to happen now. By the time you finish, rebasing CPI, the government is already targeting 15% inflation rate by this year. So by the time you finish rebasing, for example, you don't come up to say inflation rate is now 5% or 6%, okay? What will they now be saying? So the government should now go and sleep and say they have already achieved their target for 2025. So it's important that whatever you put out there, in that interview that you just played now by Bismarck Reman, he also said there that while at the time of that interview, inflation rate was around 18%, but the one that his company did was showing 40-something%. So you now find that independent, researchers tend to have inflation rates that are higher than what the official one, is saying. So it's good that at the end of the day, whatever is, published as the new inflation rate, reflects current reality. That's why I'm happy that now the basket is being expanded from 740 to 960, okay, for CPI computation. And I'm also happy that they now want to digitize the process. It's no longer a case of using manual to collect data. You're collecting from 10,000 people that give you feedback. So now it's going to be digitized. Now it's also going to expand the basket. And now I said I'm migrating from the initial divisional classifications. They had it since 1999. Okay, these 12 divisional classifications, they now want to migrate to the 2018 version, which has around 13. And again, one of the things they also said they want to do is to reduce the weight of food. The weight of food. Okay, if you know, currently the food is the one that's commanding the highest. But even by reducing the weight of food, I hope too that at the end of the day, it doesn't distort the what the reality is, because the reality is food is where the pressure is.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Basil, I got to give you the last word. What's your take on this matter of the categories, particularly illegal activities? Because we are out of time, and anything else you want to add about the rebasing very quickly?
Honestly, I'm not professionally inclined to talk about illegal activities. So let me stick with my own professional area of coverage. And that is back again to the discrepancies that we at Veriv Africa found with the food inflation calculation, using their own methodology, by the way. As you know,
NBS's methodology for calculating inflation, especially the food sub-index, is open source. It's on the website. Well, now the website cannot be accessed, unfortunately, due to some unseen government hands. But yeah, back to the crux of the matter. We found discrepancies for food inflation calculation last year. According to their own open source methodology, we carried out our own calculations. The insight is already there. You can just check verifafrica.com and search for it. And we found that based on that methodology, food inflation rate, as at the time that we did the calculation in July, it should have been around 92%.
Oh my
or
God.
even more. So you see there's a data integrity problem and a public perception problem. When you're having statistical calculation discrepancies, and then you're peaking your price reference period for 2022, and then all of a sudden, you decide that you're going to pick 2024 so that you get a ground zero that is favorable for the government. These are the issues. And this is my rallying call to professionals in the knowledge services sector. Don't keep quiet. Challenge and objectively criticize the MBS, especially with this methodology. Because at the end of the day, this is going to affect us. It's going to affect investors who want to invest. It's going to affect the work of the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee. It's going to affect National Assembly members the ones who really want to work hard. And I've been really privileged to work with some MPs who really want to fix a few things. And then, of course, governors, subnational policy makers as well. They need these numbers. And if the numbers do not accurately or near accurately capture the price changes of the aggregate economy, then there's a problem. How are you going to do responses? And sometimes, even when you're in the middle of the response, once you see a distorted inflation number, you tend to relax. Okay, inflation is now 6% thanks to the ground zero rebasing for CPI. Well, why should we heighten MPR anymore? We just go back to MPR being slashed. Understood. And then, of course, money supply starts to flood the aggregate economy. And again, inflation is back again. So at the end of the day, do we really want to rein in inflation, or do we want the government of the day in Aso Rock to feel good about themselves?
Fantastic. Great conversation, gentlemen. I had so many more questions, but we're out of time. Basil Abia, co-founder, also policy analyst at Veriv Africa, and Professor Uche Uwaleke, Professor of Capital Markets at the Nasarawa State University, KEFI, and President of the Capital Markets Academics of Nigeria. Thank you both for a very robust discussion. We await the NBS to come and answer all these questions. Thank you, gentlemen.